Hello, everyone. Hope I'm coming through loud and clear. My name is Dexter Wimberly. I'm an independent curator, and I'm excited to welcome you to this evening's open air conversation with artist Phillip Thomas. I'm going to just start by sharing Philip's bio, and then we'll get right into the conversation. Phillip Thomas was born in 1980 in Kingston, Jamaica. He holds a BFA in painting in 2003 from the Edna Manley College of Visual Arts and Performing Arts and an MFA from the New York Academy of Art. He has exhibited his work extensively in Jamaica and internationally and is represented by several major collections, or rather in several major collections. He's one of 24 artists currently included in the Kingston Biennial 2022 Pressure, an art exhibition at the National Gallery of Jamaica. To quote his artist statement, Phillip Thomas manufactures cultural reliquaries consisting of artifacts and social curiosities that represent the cultural tapestry of the Caribbean and the wider New World, using media and other agents of the Old World. We're excited to find out more about Phillip and what he's been up to. And without further ado, I welcome Phillip Thomas to today's open air conversation. Phillip, how are you?
I'm good, man. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Hopefully, everyone who's joining us this evening can hear us loud and clear because we're in for a very interesting conversation. So let's start off. Can you tell me where you are? Where are you at this moment? Where are you joining us from?
Huh. I'm at the National Gallery of Jamaica. First of all, I'd like to thank the Gantt for having us this evening. And also, I'd like to thank the National Gallery of Jamaica for creating the opportunity for us to have this dialogue.
Well, yeah, I echo that. It's really nice to chat with you. You know, you and I go back a little while. One of your major works was included in an exhibition, Coffee, Rum, Sugar, and Gold, a post-colonial paradox, and that's a show that I co-curated with Larry Jose Mensa back in 2019 at the Museum of the African San Francisco. But I also knew you before that, and so let's get right into our conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity about the work that you make and also where you live and your career. I want to
Mhm.
start with like sort of a broad question, and then we'll get into some more details. And it may be too broad, but I'll just kind of go there. Let's talk about how you define yourself as an artist. And this can kind of be general in general terms, or it can be specific terms. It could be as specific as you like. But if someone's not
Yeah.
familiar with your work, how do you discuss the work that you make?
Oh, that's a really good question. And so many artists have difficulty sometimes with giving an idea or sort of, as you will, a definition of the kind of works that you make. Of course, traditionally, I'm trained as a technical painter, let's say, but a lot of my work sort of delves into many different forms of image making. You have to understand that the context in which I'm making art from has a very specific history through its own practices, as well as how colonialism has created a kind of rift in how we go about producing works of art. So let me just sort of walk you through the ways in which the culture sort of developed over time. So 1962, Jamaica became an independent country, and this is part of the why we're having this exhibition now, is because in 62, when we got independence from the British, imagine a new culture, new flags, new idea about self, and how we've sort of decided the way how we're going to craft this new way of being as a people. And so that took us all the way through a sort of political turmoil, if you will, right up until the 1980s, which is considered maybe one of the bloodiest years in Jamaican political history. Now, 1980, of course, as you stated, when I was born, and so my entire generation is sort of forged in that kind of political uncertainty in Jamaican culture. So you find that that period is sort of a transition, if you will, between a lot of the artists that were working as pre-independent artists and a lot of the offsprings of that, which are sort of the post-independent people. Now, 1980 also is an important time, let's say in Black American culture, because if you look at our music industry, they sort of mirror as how dancehall music was more or less born in that time. Hip hop came up almost simultaneously. So this sort of state, how would I say, it? A sort of state questioning between both nations. It's sort of an interesting way how Jamaican art has sort of developed this kind of new language, a kind of break in the sort of traditional notions of state building, let's say, which is the kind of art that was made as a kind of a post-independent mantra. So, I went to the Edamame College in the early 2000s. A lot of the works that you see are sort of reliquaries, if you will, of that period. And of course, when I transitioned and went off into New York, into a whole new place, whole new ideas, and how does that culture sort of juxtapose against the culture I'm from, and this sort of rift create this sort of new language that I'm trying to embark on.
Thank you. I mean, that was a very thorough answer. um, so I read an old interview that you had done, and one of the things you said in the interview was that if our aesthetic investigations are merely remnants of the demands of the art market in other parts of the world,
Mhm.
then those demands will produce a false sense of homogeneity. And I was kind of thinking about that a lot because, as a curator, I spent a lot of time. In a way, I feel like I live in two different worlds. There's the world in the
Mm.
artist studio, where work is being made and ideas are being developed and mistakes are being made and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And then there's this world of collectors, and as much as they would like to remove the financial incentives from collecting from the conversation, it often feels like that
Hmm.
is always the sort of the underpinning of the discussion. So I just want to talk a little bit more about, the elements of this quote. You say, if our aesthetic investigations are merely remnants of the demands of the art market in other parts of the world. So can you share some more about your thinking around that? Being in
Hmm.
Jamaica, often I'm sure we all get labeled as things, right? Being labeled as
Yeah.
a Jamaican artist, a Caribbean artist, a black artist, like there's all of those like tiers and
Mhm.
labels. But I want to just hear more from you about your existence in this art market.
Right. I made that quote in reference to not just the ways in which we've come to produce art, but more so coming from an island like Jamaica that is a tourist destination. So what happens in a tourist destination is that there is the expected notions of the country that sort of live outside of the country and the actual country itself. And sometimes these two ideas of self sort of clash in this irreconcilable way. And so a lot of art for a long time has sort of tried to navigate these two ways of being. And so this is part of the reason why I made that statement, in that there's so much of how contemporary artists are trying to navigate the idea of self as is, and as honestly, the way we've forged our own thinking, and how that sort of comes up against an external idea of oneself. And so to sort of hover between these two languages is something that many people have to sort of negotiate in contemporary
Yes, yes. You also mentioned something about the difference between art and artifact, or whether making art or making artifacts,
art.
which I thought was quite
Right.
interesting. And I'd love to hear more about your thinking around that as well, because I also spend a lot of time thinking about that as it relates to Black American history.
Hmm.
And there's so much it's for me it's a catch 22. On the one hand, I think that um, unknown histories or hidden histories need to be excavated and they need to be discussed and they don't need to ever be buried again. On the other hand, I feel as though some people, not just artists, but some people get stuck in that narrative,
Mhm.
and it becomes very heavy and difficult to get out of. So I'd just like to hear more of your thinking around that as well.
Well, interesting. When I was in New York, I was sort of going to, all these grand museums and looking at these artworks that are as artifacts themselves. You know what I mean? And I used to do these what we consider in the painter's tradition the master copy, emphasis on the word master, display of the idea of the master artist uh, doing a sort of copy of something else. And so I used to take these pre-existing works, not for the works themselves, but sort of from the culture that they're from. So I copied a William Turner, of course, is an English painter, and I also copied
Right.
Giuseppe Ribera, who's a Spanish artist, but not for the artists themselves, but from the culture that they represent. Of course, as you know, both England and Spain had major colonies right throughout the Caribbean, right? So I'm looking at these artists from those cultures and sort of interrogating the ways in which they have gone about making art and the subjects that they've chose to make in their work, and how does that affect the ways in which we are seen through those works of art, through art history, through notions of blackness from a Western perspective through those works. And so I'm sort of looking at how to unravel the ways the other has sort of forged a way of seeing onto us, if that makes sense. So I'm trying to see how do we unravel this idea of self-representation, not just from my side of the argument, but also seeing it from the other side of the argument and trying to um, navigate that discussion as well. So a good example also is, I was also looking at a lot of Dutch still life paintings. And of course, a lot of those works were being made at the height of the slave trade. And so, a lot of the elements that you see in these works are, you notice a lot of tropical fruits, a lot of tropical birds, and so on. And so I used to take those paintings and sort of pull them apart from the Caribbean aesthetic in a way and sort of dismantle these objects and sort of recontextualize them as new objects or as a kind of reliquaries or something old.
And thank you. And I'm also curious to hear from you about the experience of teaching younger artists in this current political climate that we live in. I've never taught. I mean, I've lectured classes, etc., but I've never been a
Lecture,
teacher.
yeah.
And I wonder what it's like to be an art teacher today. Like, what is it like to be a lecturer or to be students today? Can you talk about that a bit?
It's a complicated process. I think one of the difficulties in navigating the formal education system um, is the idea that you can teach art in a particular kind of rubric and expect a particular kind of result. And so art is something that's far more organic in a kind of way. And in order to deliver certain ideas about art and aesthetics, of course, you can sort of operate in some kind of structure, but largely a lot of art learning is something that occurs organically. And so the difficulty is how do I, as a practicing artist, figure out ways of translating uh, certain bits of information that occur outside of the classroom within a classroom setting. So it's a really complicated process that you have to, as it were, learn as you go.
And and one of the other things that I'm curious to get your opinion on is this current state of sort of contemporary art as it relates to social media, as it relates to galleries, and you know,
Hmm.
I love it, and also my perception is obviously, although I don't live in the U.S. currently, until recently I did. So my perception is from a very sort of American centric way of looking at that. So I'm
Hmm.
curious, for someone who lives in Jamaica, how do you view the current state of sort of social media as it relates to emerging the mid-career artists and what that medium or those mediums are doing in the space?
Well, I mean, that's a very complicated question because social media itself is such a new thing. I mean, we're still sort of seeing the ongoing ramifications of what social media does to the actual society. We're still learning. It's such a new medium to work with. And so it's kind of difficult to say these are the ways that social media work in this particular time because we're not yet seeing how the effect of people who are trying to forge this professional notion of being an artist through social media, posting and so on. It's not something that I spend too much time on, to be honest. And this is why it's a kind of a difficult question for me because it's not my natural forte, if you will. But I do understand how it is meaningful for younger artists to sort of, present themselves to the world. Of course, without a doubt, social media has broken apart the traditional ways that artists go about interfacing with the public, let's say, through a gallery, through a sort of dealership system, through, it sort of broke apart this kind of specific rigid idea about how to enter the art world. And so, people are sort of using their own methods because social media sort of democratized the entire landscape.
Thank you. You know, there's also been a lot of discussion about the some might describe hyper professionalization of emerging artists,
Mhm.
uh, and the term hyper professionalization. I think that to some degree, artists need to learn about business related skills as early as possible. I do believe
Mhm.
that firmly, but I also believe that artists aren't being given time to develop. I really also believe that too, and it's problem. I think it's problematic. That's just my opinion. When people
Mhm.
ask me, who are the artists that you're seeing that you think have the most potential for the future, I don't know how to answer that question actually.
That's
How
well.
about you?
I mean, uh, oftentimes when people ask questions like that, nobody really could answer. Anybody in the art profession really couldn't answer a question like that. It's something you ask a hedge fund manager about hedge fund or something to make a kind of projection about the ways in which an artist is going to work. It's just one of the most ridiculous ideas you can ever imagine. But uh, in the same way, a person would ask you that question. Artists are also thinking in those terms to meet that demand. You see what I mean? And that's where the professionalization comes from. And so, art school, residencies, all of these things have become this sort of system that artists have to sort of go through these sort of very professional steps in order to craft the most professional outlook on your career, let's say. Um, but the act of making artwork itself, as any artist will tell you, is far more organic than that. It's far more elusive than that. And so the question is, how do you take a system and sort of put something sort of organic to fit within this notion of being a professional artist? And therein lies the question. So yes, I would agree with it in saying that the concept of over professionalizing one's practice can be a problem, but we'll see how that one turns out.
Thank you, thank you. Can you share a little bit about your process of making art? Are you in the studio every day, 4 times a week, from morning to night? Like, what's your process like? I mean, you don't have to get into, you don't have to give us any trade secrets, right? But I'm just curious
No.
to know what's your uh, what's your average like week like for you around art making and all the other things that you do?
Well, usually people ask similar version to that is how long does it take to make? And then when they ask that, they really mean man hours, right? But again, going back to what we were talking about before, that's producing a work of art is something uh, far more organic in a way, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the time spent producing is the same time or the measure time you spend thinking, living, experiencing, trying to craft a way of seeing. And so that is something far more complicated in how one produces a work of art. And so to answer your question, it's really a very complicated one because even though I'm an academic painter, and you think that there were sort of specific steps that one used to produce specific works of art, it's way more organic, my process. Um, in making artworks, I often engage in a lot of writing, a lot of research, a lot of things that are outside of the studio. You know what I mean? And so sometimes, when I'm also in the studio working, I'm, listening to music. I'm also a trained pianist, so sometimes I'm playing music, I'm writing music, I'm doing all sorts of things that sort of exercise the full breadth of what it means to be a creative person. The painting or whatever it is that I produce comes all the way at the very end of that lived experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. There's so much to that I wanna unpack.
Yeah.
I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is that many of these questions about, like for example, how long does it take to make a painting or something like that? Many of those questions are really rooted in someone to reverse engineer the value of your
Hmm.
time, right? That's kind of
Oh
like
yeah.
a right. That's kind of like what it is, right? So you say something costs X, then they might be trying to figure out, well, if it only took you 20 hours, then they're coming at it from a very sort of capitalist, labor oriented, Western, economic way of trying to like look at labor and manpower or labor
Mhm.
in general. Uh, and it's sneaky, right? Because I mean, that's basically what that is. That's like oftentimes someone
Mhm.
trying to figure out like what your labor is worth. And so
Yes.
I love the fact that you acknowledge that all of the things that you do, reading, whether it's specific research around a painting or work that you plan to make, or reading just to learn more about the world,
Mhm.
traveling, doing these other things. That's what really informs the work. And I think that for a lot of younger artists that might be trying to figure this out, I think it's important that they really lean into that reality. You're making whatever medium you're working in, you're making the work. Sure, you're in your studio X amount of hours a day or a week, but that's not the equation for the value of your work, right? There's something completely untethered from that. um, and so I know we have a number of images of works that we're going to get into in a few minutes, and while that gets
Sure.
loaded up, I'd love to hear about the biennial that's going on, and sort of what the experience has been like around that in Jamaica. Like what's the past like few months been like around that exhibition?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. It's really been good. and this is why I opted to host my half of the conversation here, because it's it's as you said, it's 24 artists, and what the curators have done. Very interesting thing is that they've looked at Jamaican artists that are currently living and working in Jamaica and artists that are outside of the country. So again, remember we talked about this idea of the external view. And so that's an interesting way to sort of juxtapose these two groups of artists and to see sort of where are the consistent threads and where they actually diverge. And so it's a sort of discussion between the idea of Jamaica in transit, if you will, a kind of idea of Jamaica homegrown and Jamaica as a sort of external view. And so that I think is a very meaningful way in how we've gone about producing this exhibition.
And the work that you have in the exhibition, so obviously there's a work behind you, and I think we have an image of that work for the slideshow. But while that gets loaded, can you talk a little bit more about the materials you use in making your work? And then when we're looking at the images, that might help people sort of better understand what they're looking at.
Right. Well, there are several ways in which I've gone about producing works of art. Of course, traditionally, as an oil painter, everyone knows the fundamental materials, all right? But then what happens when you take those materials and you start to add or subtract, you start to break up, or you start to question the very nature of the substance itself that you're using. So for a long time, for instance, I used to make my own paints, but I would use particular ingredients that would, in a way, craft their own narrative in how the materials are being used. And it's a sort of a traditional way in which, for instance, if you look at a lot of art from the Renaissance and how the color makers would have a kind of, as it were, nationalism in color making, like Naples yellow and all sort of stuff, where the idea of making color from a particular soil or from a particular region, and it carries a particular kind of idea about the sort of color, whatever it is that you want to call it. I was doing a lot of similar things with, for instance, bauxite dirt, which is one of the things that we mine in Jamaica, and it's one of the things that we've used really throughout the development of the country as part of the catalyst for national development, finance, things like that. And so I was using this. It's a sort of a reddish brown color, and so a lot of the works I was making use this color as a kind of primary base, as a kind of way to say, oh, I'm using this color from the soil of Jamaica, if you will,
Right.
and sort of uh, made it into a kind of language of its own.
Thank you. We have a question that came in, so we're still waiting for the slideshow to get started, but oh, there we go.
Oh,
Awesome,
here we go.
awesome. So let me ask you this question before you talk about this work that's on screen
Sure.
now. Um, can you tell us a bit more about the importance of music to your work as a painter? What's the relationship between the two in your practice? I would say, if any.
Yeah, I mean, the language of music, even though it's an audio language, does carry a lot of the same text, like harmony, tone, certain musical phrasing sort of oscillates between the notions of color and the notions of sound. And synesthetics will sort of show you, well, teach you how sometimes sound can be represented by a color, let's say. And so,
Mm,
as somebody who's trained in music, I sort of think in sound even visually. You know what I mean? And so that's how I kind of go about thinking about these different disciplines, but how the consistency fluctuates between them.
Thank you. Before I get to the next question, since I was really excited to talk about the work, we want to talk about this particular painting that's on screen now. Can you what would you like to share about this work? I have some questions, but just in general
Yeah,
terms, what is the narrative, or what are we seeing here? What is this scene?
right. So this is the second of two works, right? The first work, titled Britain 7, was made in Jamaica. And it was a painting of seven young men that were killed by the state. Some people say unjustly, and others say, the opposite. And when I made that painting, it was an interesting point in my development as an artist because it was at that moment I realized that there's a difference between the national narrative and what happens at the local site. So, for instance, um, nationally, so many people were, of course, saying, this is sort of an unjust killing. It was in many ways a kind of George Floyd moment for us, even though I don't necessarily want to compare the two. But when you go to the actual, and I didn't live too far from the place where it happened, you were hearing different discussions with it, and I became very interested in the ideas between these two discussions, right? And so this painting is a sort of a continuation of that first painting, Entry. And so this was made when I went to New York. And of course, uh, it was actually the first time I actually left my country. So it's not the idea of, oh, I'm just sort of traveling. I'm going into a whole new experience for the first time. And so I lived off the N train. And so I was using the title of the actual train itself as a kind of uh, hint, if you will, of the problems of immigration itself. Because the idea of immigration, as we're seeing now, is centered largely around the problems of race as well. And so it's sort of creating a kind of double narrative between both myself going into this new space and the ideas around immigration as a much broader problem. So if you notice how the procession of the figures are almost are set in the opposite direction of the train itself. You see what I mean? And so that uh, uh, disagreement, if you will, wanting to go in another direction, even though the object that is supposed to take you is going in the opposite direction. That disagreement, if you will, is in a way a metaphor for a lot of what's happening in immigration itself. There's so many people that don't want to leave their homeland, the place they grew up in, the country they love. But the conditions are as such that it drives the person to make these treacherous decisions. And so that painting sort of came together at a uh, very important point in my own development as an artist.
Do you still have this work, or is it out the door? I imagine you don't still have
It's
it.
I don't have it anymore. Which I mean, that's another subject in and of itself. How does artists of the region, artists in smaller states, because a lot of people don't understand that there's so much of our work that leaves the region. It's easy for me to say 95% of the work I've made doesn't reside even in the Caribbean. You know what I mean? And so that's a large sort of exodus of asset, if you will. And so that's a whole other problem that I think really needs to be discussed.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's something that not too many artists that I've talked to have brought that up. It's an interesting point. Because of the way the art world functions, collectors
Mm,
are constant. They tend to be concentrated in certain parts of the world. Surely there are collectors everywhere, but
sure.
if you just had to guess, artwork lands, there are probably a handful of countries and a handful of cities within those countries that have a high probability of being where that artwork lands.
Hmm.
And that has I think a profound effect on the future of the work and the future of artists. But as they say, I digress. Let's advance to the next image, and I'd love to ask you another question that's come in the meantime. So
Sure.
before we get to this painting or this mixed media work, the question is, what's your greatest task to undertake as a teacher? I mean, what do you hope to transfer most to your students?
Um, that's a really good question. Oftentimes, in any of the disciplines in art, a lot of teachers, I think, have the issue of teaching the student how to be themselves, if you will. And a lot of lecturers, I find, not just in the classroom, but also outside of it, try to make clones of themselves. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? And that can be a profound problem. And I know lots of professional artists, for years after graduating their whatever institution they went to, still deal with the overbearing presence of whatever lecturer they had before in the past.
Wow.
So yeah, those things are really a difficult thing for artists to get over, especially if it's the people that you highly respect, things like that. And so I think the most important thing is for the lecturer to uh, help the student to develop their own ideas about art, as opposed to just making a clone of oneself.
That is a great answer, Philip. I love that. I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's talk about this work that's on screen. Actually, this is a piece that I've seen in person, so I'm like really, happy to hear what you have to say about this work.
Right, right. So a lot of this, well, one of the difficult things about this talk, for instance, is to select particular works of art that, in a way, present entire groups of paintings I've made, right? So each work that you're seeing fits sort of in a category of many other paintings that I've made around this particular theme. And this particular work sits in this sort of I was looking at gardens for a while, and well, the idea of the liminal space, let's say. And of course, as you know, in terms of architecture, our garden sits between what we call the great house in Jamaican language and the fields, let's say, right? And so in that space between the so-called great house and the fields is this interaction between the house owner and the folks that work the fields, this crossing between the gardener and the homeowner. And sometimes the homeowner and the gardener can be one and the same. And so this collapsing of these spaces is something that I found a lot of um, interaction, whether it be between race and class. The power dynamics are as such in this space that I produce a whole body of work just on what sits in the garden. And so if you look at the painting there, you'll see a lot of tools for uh, um, gardening, and those are juxtaposed to high-powered machine guns, let's say, or machetes that are, in any of the Caribbean states, you'll know that slavery is one experience where gardening tools are the primary source for weaponry. And so gardening tools in Jamaica, they sort of fluctuate between these two places. A thing of weaponry and also a thing to till the soil. And so this mixing of high-powered weaponry and gardening tools is something that I've done in many works. And so, the image in the background, for instance, sort of echoes the idea of this sort of militarism set before a garden, let's say.
Great, great. Since we have several more images and a brief video to get to, in the interest of time, I want to advance to the
Yeah.
next work.
Yes. Sure.
And I have a
Again,
question before you.
mhm.
Sorry, I have a question
No, go ahead.
before you get into this work. Are you are you referencing any actual people in these works, or are these figures from your travels, research, imagination?
Well, there are several ways I've gone about uh, portrait painting, let's say. Not portrait painting in a formal sense, but figure representation. Oftentimes, I sort of use uh, the idea of the blank feature, let's say. So this particular work that you're seeing on the screen now, it's sort of in reference to a lot of what people like Kerry James Marshall, for instance, was doing or is doing, and that entire tradition of the color of the skin as metaphor, as opposed to the color of the skin being used as sort of figurative art representation. It's not a sort of realistic rendition of what the skin looks like, but a sort of idea of blackness, right? And so within that frame, I've often transitioned between the idea of the silhouette, pure silhouette, and the sort of darkened skin to the point where it's almost a silhouette. And so that
Mm.
difference, I think, is something that I've used to talk about the difference within the realm of blackness itself, as opposed to blackness as against whiteness. So in other words, the idea of expanding the ways of being black is something that I've used various forms of silhouettes to express.
Thank you. So, obviously, when someone looks at this work, the first thing they would typically ask you about are the two figures in the foreground. But I'm actually
Mhm.
equally interested in the wallpaper in the background. So
Right.
I'd love to hear what's happening in this wallpaper. And that's something you've revisited in other works, if I'm not
Mhm.
mistaken, this wallpaper. Can you talk a bit about the activities, like what's going on in this wallpaper and why that decision?
Mhm. So the wallpaper in the background is known as a toile, and it's a kind of decorative wallpaper. And if you look at the imagery in it, it sort of looks like what you typically see in a Rococo painting, almost like a Fragonard or something like that. But what I've done is that I've sort of went into the wallpaper itself and in a way placed figures in order to change the narrative of what's happening in that space. And so, in a way, there's an entire almost opposite narrative that's happening in the background of the painting as opposed to what's happening in the foreground of the painting, right? And so, if you look at, and I wish we had details to show exactly what was happening, but you're seeing executions happening in the background. You're seeing that juxtaposed to somebody playing golf. You're seeing a sort of range of um, seemingly incongruous activities occurring simultaneously across the board, and then that sort of sits as a separate narrative that's occurring outside of what's happening in the foreground of the picture. You see? So this particular painting, and, and it's a really sad for me to get into, but it's important because you asked about the student-teacher relationship earlier on. So about a year ago, a student of mine went out, his friends to do a mural painting, and it so happened that they were in a particular part of Kingston where there's a certain amount of gang activity that was happening, and there was police presence. There was sort of a patrol happening at the time. Anyway, they decided to leave the area, and because there was gunfire happening around the corner, and when they went into the car and then decided that they're going to take off, the police sort of blocked them in the front, and this is what the story I'm getting from him. And the guys came out and they just light up the vehicle. I have his body was broken up so badly. I had no idea if he would survive this ordeal, right? And so I made this painting um, to talk about the ways in which violence and the notions of how violence as a almost random act in certain cases is something so unpredictable, so unnecessary, um, and just it creates a kind of situation where it's almost impossible to comprehend why that would even occur to a person. You know, why that would happen in the ways that it often happens, especially to people that look like us, right? And so a lot of that stuff I've been really struggling with. And if you look at that broad swath of my work, it deals with the problems of violence and how we've come to treat each other as people, you know, and how other people often treat us as well. So those are some of the themes that this particular work is dealing with.
Thank you for sharing that. Let's advance to the next one, and we're going to go through the next few images a bit more briskly because I'm keeping an eye on time here.
And
So
time,
the question
I mean, no, go ahead, sorry.
question I have about this work, you've made some very specific fashion decisions with these figures, and I'm curious to hear about that. And I
Mhm.
know I'm not the first person at all to ask about that, but I'm curious to hear about the fashion decisions and also some of the things that are going on in the background of this work.
Well, let me hear what the particular things you wanted to ask about.
Well, I mean, there's a specific kind of suiting and way of dress here. Is this something that is meant to evoke a certain sort of class or aristocracy, or what's the thinking behind the
Mhm.
three-piece suit and the tie?
Mhm. Well, if, again, you look at a lot of my work, it is presentation sort of shows up time and again. And it's something that I've had to readdress over and over. Now, to give you the context of how Jamaican art functions, you have to first understand that. And going back to some of the things we said about the ideas of how we're seen, and in turn how we see ourselves, right? So Jamaican art, if you will, operates as a kind of has a kind of expected narrative. And what has happened in Jamaican art itself is that it has created this idea of Jamaicanness, right? And so this Jamaicanness uh, has within it a kind of expectation that the way you present Jamaican art sits within the broader construct of what we call working class poor Jamaicans. And so what that
Hmm.
does is that it creates a kind of isolating narrative. And at the same time, it creates a space where the several other types of Jamaican expression that one might have does not actually get recorded in the tapestry of Jamaican art. And so the vast majority of Jamaican art is a sort of a chronicling of one specific demographic. And so a lot of the things that I've really struggled against in my own practice is how do we, again, involve the country honestly and openly so that each group or idea or demographic of Jamaican has the same responsibilities in our aesthetic
Hmm.
creation, if you understand what I mean. Because when you create
Hmm.
these isolating pockets to suggest that only the representation of certain kinds of Jamaican can be understood as being authentic, then you're creating a sort of space for other groups of Jamaicans to not have the same responsibility to the idea
Right.
of nation, the idea of culture, the idea of self-representation. And so that's one of the reasons why I've created this presentation and then infuse that, as you say, upper middle class presentation with some of the same barbarities that we expect from other groups of people. And it's a really dishonest way I think we've gone about setting up how we talk about specific groups of people while letting other groups of people off the hook, if you will. So that's one of the things that I've for years try and really level the playing field in representation.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So, this is a very, very different work,
Yeah.
and with completely different contexts. So, just if you could,
Mhm.
just for a minute, why the
Yeah.
tank, and what is, sort of what is what's the action here in this work?
Mhm. So again, a lot of my work centers around militarism and that in a way, of course, uh, notions of violence as an umbrella subject, if you will. So a few years ago, right here in downtown Kingston, there was I guess what we might call a strongman or Don or something of the sort. A man by the name of Douglas Coke, who uh, ran afoul of the law, and it became such a sort of military enterprise to have him extradited to the United States of America. And so the state moved in with the heaviest armament you can imagine, right? And this is a civilian population. And so it's one of the things that I think first world countries don't understand is that, in a lot of developing countries, it is not uncommon to see military grade weapon rolling down the street. You know, what I mean, it's not uncommon to any Jamaican to see um, armored personnel carriers filled with the Jamaican military just rolling down the street in traffic. That's doing all sorts of military operations in their own country. I don't think any American would experience their military, certainly not in a capacity for violence in their own country. You know what I mean? And
Right.
so that is something that is an experience to any developing country that is a special one, let me say it that way. So this particular painting, even though the circumstance, it seems as if it's some far-flung Vietnam War or something of the sort. It's something that I'm using to represent militarism right here in Jamaica. And it's something that represents that particular period that we've gone through.
That's very powerful. Very powerful. Um, and so, the work that's on screen now kind of combines a lot of the different things that you've talked about up until this point, right?
Hmm.
There's the figures in the foreground with very specific, but this in the back. There's the camouflage that is sort of occurs in many of your works. Um, this piece, if I'm not mistaken, is called Pimper's Paradise.
Hmm.
Is that correct? And so,
Yes.
why that? So I haven't asked you this about the prior works, but why that title? I know that song. Why that title?
You know the song. For those of you who don't know, it's taken from a song by Bob Marley. And it's again going back to, well, the full title of the work is Pimper's Paradise, Terra Nova Nights Edition. Terra Nova is a bar in Kingston, a sort of a high-end bar restaurant, whatever it is you might call it. And it's this place where a lot of middle and upper middle class Jamaicans congregate, and it creates this kind of scenario. And I often go there to make notes of things, make notes of interactions, the way in which groups of people get together and sort of assess each other. And so this particular work, in a way, recreates a lot of this atmosphere and sort of creates an almost a bedroom scenario where the uh, ideas of how human interaction result is sort of pronounced as a sort of huge tapestry. And again, going back to what we spoke about earlier on about what's going on in the background, again, if you look at the details of the work, the same sort of violence, the same sort of state killings, the same sort of things that are being ignored by a lot of this group of people is again occurring simultaneously with, with what's happening in the foreground.
Thank you for sharing that. So before we end today, we have a video to give folks a bit of an insight into the Kingston Biennial. So we'll play this video, and then I have a final question to ask you after we've played this. So let's watch.
Sure.
Thank you so much for putting that together. It's incredibly rare during these talks that we actually get to see the work by other artists. It's
I
usually only
know.
the artists we're in conversation with. And so here's my question. It's not about the biennial. It's not about anything we've talked about so far. It's what are you looking forward to? What's the project? What's the thing that you have going on that you're really excited about right now?
Yeah, I'm sort of working towards a solo exhibition next year. I've a couple of other projects I'm working on. I'm always constantly working on different things, different ideas. And so it's as a practicing artist, that's sort of what you do. It's you're always producing, you're always thinking, you're always trying, new things with your work. You're always trying to develop on particular ideas that you may have had 10 years ago that may have found new life in a new way. Um, so artists are always sort of looking at what they've made and sort of crafting different ways of seeing some of the same ideas, some of the same problems that we have as people. It's for me, a lot of art projects aren't just projects of aesthetics. You understand what I mean? It's the way we are interacting as people, and that is getting reaffirmed every day. Those ideas are changing every day. And so any artist that is clued into human interaction has to be an artist that's always reassessing, re-understanding.
Can't for your generosity, your time today, and you've given me a lot of things to think about as well. I have some new ideas as a result of our conversation. That's always a good sign for me. I hope to see you very, very soon. I haven't been to Jamaica in
Yeah,
years, and
yeah.
I don't know the time you'll be in the States, or maybe we'll see each other someplace else. But I really do appreciate
Yeah,
the
yeah.
work that you do. Appreciate you as an artist and as a human being. Thank you for today. So I'm going to be
Thank
closing out today's conversation with my final words. So thank you so much, Philip. The Gantt
thank you.
Center's goal is to always provide programs that inform and inspire. The support of viewers like you allows the Gantt Center to expand its reach and further develop programs like Open Air. To learn more about the ways you can support the Gantt Center, please visit their website. It's ganttcenter.org/donate. Also, be sure to click the subscribe button below to be updated on all future virtual programs. We thank you all for joining us for a great conversation with Phillip Thomas. And we look forward to next month's open air with artist Yashua Klaus on Tuesday, November 8th. You can always find out more by following the Gantt Center on social media. Thank you all. Be safe and have a wonderful night. Take care.